In Iceland, the stories say that during the long winter nights of Yule, an old woman named Grýla descends from the mountains. She seeks children who have been naughty. Some say she carries a cauldron. Others say she leaves small trinkets or candies to lure them closer. Nobody truly sees her, yet her presence is felt in the frost that forms along empty corridors, in the whisper of the wind through dark rooms, in sudden chills that sweep over the body. I never believed these tales, not until I met her myself, long before I became the engineer stationed at this research facility where my story begins. I had volunteered to stay at the remote research station during Yule because of a staffing shortage, partly out of responsibility, partly because I sought solitude. The station was buried beneath heavy snow, and the wind cut through the metal walkways like a sharp blade. The landscape outside was white and unbroken, the sky heavy with clouds that pressed down with a pale, diffused light. My days were filled with routine inspections, valves, gauges, checking equipment to ensure nothing failed under the bitter cold. Everything outside was normal, procedural, predictable. Still, there was a tension under the surface, an awareness in the corridors that felt like the station itself responded when I paused, when I turned my attention to something small, like a frost line on a railing or a dull echo in a vent. Memories from my childhood sometimes surfaced during those long, lonely hours. I was 7, standing alone in the snow outside my family's home when I first saw her. She seemed enormous, or perhaps I was small. Her hair was disheveled, wild in the wind. Her coat was ragged, dark, thick like the fur of some ancient animal. Long, claw-like fingers reached toward me. Her voice, low and almost melodic, called my name. I ran. My heart pounded in my chest. Yet I remembered everything. The sharpness of the cold that night, the ice underfoot, the chill that seemed to radiate from her very presence. Other engineers continued their rounds. Eric, my supervisor, moved efficiently, eyes scanning instruments, unaware of the subtle cold or the shadows that caught my attention. I said nothing. I did not yet know what to make of the faint impressions left in the corners of my perception. I simply recorded them in my memory, noting how they echoed the winter long past, how the smallest brush of cold seemed heavier, more deliberate than it had any right to be. At night, the wind battered the station. I would stand at the window, watching the snow swirl in thick curtains across the frozen landscape. The metal of the railing was icy under my gloves. The world outside was white and silent. Yet in that silence, I sometimes felt a presence, not tangible, not audible, but there in the way the air shifted, the way shadows bent across the floor. The memory of that night as a child returned in fragments. The wild hair, the ragged coat, the reaching fingers. It was only a memory, nothing more. Yet the impression of it clung to me, as if waiting for recognition. There was a strange comfort in routine. The cold was predictable, the instruments reliable, the schedule strict. It allowed the mind to focus, to observe, without fear, without imagination wandering too far. Still, in the pauses when I allowed myself a quiet moment by the panels or the generator room, my thoughts wandered back to that night. I could picture the dark eyes, the elongated fingers, the way the wind seemed to bend around her. My pulse quickened slightly at the memory, though I told myself it was only recollection, not a present threat. The station, I realized, was a world apart, isolated, mechanical, efficient. And yet, as I moved through corridors, I became acutely aware of each sound. The hum of the heaters, the distant groan of metal contracting in the cold, the soft scraping of snow across the outer walkways. I cataloged everything, as always, noting the subtle shifts in the environment, though at this stage there was nothing anomalous, just the precise, almost intimate observation of a veteran engineer in a remote place. And so my first days passed, orderly and careful. The outside remained a frozen expanse, the wind relentless, the snow endless. Inside, the station functioned perfectly, and I, standing among valves and panels, instruments and metal walkways, carried a memory of a winter long past, a single night that had left an impression I could not erase. The legend of Grýla was just that, a story, an echo of childhood fears. Before we go any deeper, take a moment to leave a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from, and whether you've ever heard anything like this yourself. If you enjoy the story, hit that like button and subscribe. Thanks. The days passed slowly, measured by the hum of the heaters and the routine of checking panels, gauges, and valves. Outside, the snow piled higher against the station walls, shifting in small drifts with each gust of wind. The cold was persistent, a constant weight pressing through the metal walkways and into the joints of the station. I began noticing small anomalies, At first, nothing I could explain. A subtle draft along a corridor where the ventilation should have been stagnant. A faint frost forming along the edges of a panel that I had checked hours before. These were minor things, inconsequential, the kind of details one might overlook or attribute to the station's age and inefficiency. At first, I ignored them. I focused on the mechanical realities, pipes that could contract or expand, valves that might not seal perfectly in extreme cold, the subtle shift of air caused by pressure differences. I logged the readings meticulously. There was no reason to suspect anything beyond natural causes. Yet, the incidents began to accumulate. Small fluctuations in temperature, brief chills that seemed to radiate from specific points along the corridors rather than the overall station. Occasionally, a soft, indistinct sound would reach me, an echo, perhaps, from a loose panel or the wind whistling through a vent. I found myself pausing, half listening, half convinced that there was a presence behind the sound. My pulse would quicken slightly, though I reminded myself it was only perception, a mind playing tricks in isolation. The seasonal atmosphere seemed to accentuate the strangeness. Lights flickered unpredictably in a way that suggested candlelight rather than electrical faults. A faint scent of pine or smoke would linger near a doorway, impossible to trace. It was subtle, evanescent, yet it pricked at memory like a shadow of recognition. These fleeting impressions seemed to pulse around the station, not threatening, not overt, but tangible enough to demand acknowledgement. I thought of the old legends, stories I had heard as a child. Children disappearing at Yule, small trinkets, and candies left in strange places to lure them closer, whispers in the dark. The tales had seemed fanciful then, a means of scaring children into obedience. Now alone, these stories felt oddly alive, not entirely dismissible. I did not speak of this to anyone. To do so would have seemed irrational, unprofessional. The other engineers carried on with their work, voices steady, movements methodical. Occasionally, I would find small objects left in places I was certain I had already inspected. A scrap of paper with barely legible marks, a tiny candy wrapper on a railing. They were insignificant, almost absurd, yet each one drew my attention in a way that demanded curiosity. I cataloged them silently, noting locations and times, checking to ensure that no one else had been on those sections of the station. Nothing explained these discoveries. I began to notice patterns. The anomalies were not random. There was a rhythm, subtle but distinct. Frost appeared along the same edges of panels. The soft sounds echoed from similar distances, often from around corners I had just passed. Drafts seemed to move in sync with my movement, becoming perceptible when I stopped, dissipating when I walked past. The station itself seemed to respond, subtly, to attention, as though the environment remembered where I lingered. The seasonal cues reinforced the disquiet. Snow drifted outside in undulating waves. A faint echo of carol-like sounds would rise from the wind, not enough to be recognizable, yet suggestive of voices in the distance. The temperature would shift suddenly, not uniformly, but in small pockets. An icy breath along a corridor wall, a chill brushing against my sleeves. It was always local, precise, and impossible to rationalize completely. Even Eric, busy with his rounds, seemed oblivious. The others carried on, their actions predictable, their awareness confined to instruments and checklists. I, on the other hand, began to navigate with care, pausing less, moving deliberately, noting every detail. Lingering seemed to provoke responses. Moving continuously reduced them, though never fully eliminated the sense of observation. At times, I would catch a fragment of sound that mimicked the inflection of a child's voice, or my own name, whispered faintly. Not consistent, not aggressive, just insistent enough to turn my head and search, always finding nothing. My mind rejected superstition, attributing it to acoustics or mechanical resonance. Yet, even as I reasoned it away, the sensation persisted. Someone or something was aware of my presence. The small trinkets continued to appear. Sometimes a candy wrapper tucked into a seam of the floor panel. Other times, a scrap of paper, folded and placed as though left intentionally. The handwriting or marks were almost childish, haphazard. Each time, I paused, checking the surroundings carefully. There was no one. There had to be a logical explanation, a previous shift's forgotten items, a misplaced personal belonging. Yet, the accumulation, the patterns, made such explanations unsatisfying. And still, I observed. I did not chase these impressions. I cataloged them. I moved carefully, deliberately. I adjusted my steps and timing, noting the response of the station. Frost lines formed where I lingered. Drafts shifted as I passed. Sounds, indistinct yet purposeful, echoed just after my attention moved away. There was awareness, not malice. Intelligence, perhaps, but patient, distant. I found myself more vigilant than usual, scanning corridors before entering, checking corners I would normally ignore. Every sound was catalogued. Every flicker of light or unusual reflection noted. The smallest detail, an odd placement of dust, a scrap of frost, a faint scent, was enough to command attention. The station, once simply a place of work, had become an interactive environment, and I, unwillingly, its participant. Despite the isolation, the station felt alive. Not conscious, not in any human sense, but reactive. It remembered my movements, echoed them subtly. It responded, though never overtly, never aggressively. The faint, almost imperceptible patterns of frost, sound, drafts, and light had begun to dominate my perception. I realized that careful observation was no longer optional. I could not ignore the signs. They demanded acknowledgement. And somewhere, in the midst of these subtle shifts and tiny signals, the stories of Grýla returned. Not as fear, not as legend, but as an almost tangible notion. Small, insistent, elusive. It was as if the environment itself recalled those old tales, murmuring them faintly along the edges of corridors, in the touch of cold metal, in the drafts that carried nothing but suggestion. I did not yet connect the memory to the present. I simply observed, catalogued, and moved, fully aware that the station had begun to respond to me in ways that were both meticulous and persistent. I began to notice patterns. At first, they were almost imperceptible. A frost line along the edge of a panel that seemed to form faster than the ambient cold could explain. A slight draft through a vent that shouldn't have had airflow. Lights flickering in the corridors at odd intervals, brief and unremarkable, yet noticeable if I paused for the right moment. Each anomaly alone could be explained, easily dismissed, but together they formed a rhythm I could not ignore. Small traces began to appear. I would find tiny scratches on metal handrails, just enough to catch my attention, but not enough to be accidental damage. Sometimes candy wrappers, yellowed and crumpled, would be tucked in corners or small, folded scraps of paper with childish scrawl, letters, perhaps, or messages left by someone who had the patience to wait. The first time I saw one, I thought it was a prank left by a passing technician. But as the days passed, they continued, each subtly different from the last, and always in the areas I lingered, the places where I paused and adjusted gauges or wrote notes. It was difficult not to think of the old stories. The Icelandic legends of Grýla were fleeting thoughts at first, a distant memory from childhood of a woman who came during Yule, seeking children. She left small things, she left candy, she waited. The thought made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to rationalize. There was no Grýla here, only frost, only drafts, only shadows that seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. The whispers started next. Not words, not language, just sounds faint, drawn from the edges of hearing, curling through the corridors. Sometimes it was a soft call, almost like someone calling my name, but more melodic, low, and patient. I would stop and listen, but the corridor would be empty. I never felt threatened, not physically, but the feeling of being observed settled in my chest like a weight, quiet and unyielding. Patterns emerged not only in objects or sounds, but in behavior. Whenever I paused too long near a panel or leaned over a control board, the temperature would dip noticeably. The frost would form more quickly. The flickering lights would linger just a fraction longer. If I hurried, these anomalies would recede, subtle but perceptible. It was as if the environment itself responded to my attention. I began to move differently, no longer casually checking gauges or taking long notes at the consoles. I would approach, glance, adjust, and move on. It was an unconscious adaptation, born of observation, not fear. The more I adhered to this new rhythm, the more the signs seemed deliberate, almost intelligent. They were patient, measured, waiting for me to notice, but never forcing an encounter. Outside, the snow fell in heavy drifts, piling against the station walls. The wind carried faint, hollow echoes, sounds that reminded me of distant carols, or perhaps the memory of a melody I had heard once in childhood, on a winter night I would never forget. The corridors inside felt colder, tighter, more responsive. Air seemed to shift against me, subtle, tangible, a presence that was never fully seen but undeniably felt. And I began to notice the little things more, the weight of my own steps, the way shadows clung in corners, how light reflected off icy surfaces. Sometimes a small item would appear where I'd been only moments before, a note or a scrap of candy, almost as if placed for me to see, to guide my movement without words. Each one drew my eyes, my attention, and my mind, weaving an unseen pattern I could not resist following. It was in this gradual unfolding that I realized something had not only observed me, it had learned me. The anomalies responded to my behavior, mirrored my attention, and adjusted in complexity when I lingered. Yet it never attacked. It simply existed in parallel, patient and deliberate. I understood, with a slow certainty, that I was being watched in the same way I had been long ago, as a child. In that night, I could barely remember without shivering. The same curiosity, the same intent, now present in this isolated winter station. By then, I had stopped questioning whether the anomalies were real. The question had shifted to something else, how they behaved and why they followed me so precisely. The frost no longer appeared randomly. It formed in deliberate places. Along the edges of door frames, I passed through slowly, across railings where I paused to write notes, at the base of stairwells where I lingered longer than necessary. The patterns were clean, almost careful. They did not spread. They traced. The temperature followed the same logic. Entire sections of the station remained stable, but the air around me would thin and sharpen when I hesitated. A sudden drop, localized and exact. When I moved again, the cold eased, retreating as if satisfied. I logged these changes out of habit, though I no longer believe the logs were for anyone else. Physical evidence accumulated. The candy wrappers appeared more frequently now, never torn or crushed, always intact. Sometimes folded neatly, sometimes placed atop equipment housings, where no one would casually leave them. The scraps of paper changed as well. The markings were no longer random. Lines curved into shapes that resembled letters, though never complete words. Childlike, uneven, patient. I stopped discarding them. I began carrying them in my pocket, unsure why. It felt wrong to leave them behind. The sound returned more often. Not louder, never louder, but closer. Always just beyond direct hearing. It never came from behind me. Always from ahead, around corners, at the far end of corridors. A low tone, almost melodic, almost kind. When I followed it, it receded. When I stopped, it waited. The station reacted to my decisions now. If I took a different route than usual, the air shifted to guide me back. A draft pressed gently against my side. Light dimmed slightly in the wrong direction and brightened ahead. Nothing forceful, nothing urgent, just suggestion. I understood then that this was not pursuit. It was invitation. The first true contact happened in the auxiliary maintenance wing, an area rarely used during winter. The lights there were dimmer, older. I had no operational reason to be there, but I felt drawn toward it by a sequence of small signs. A wrapper placed at an intersection, a drop in temperature that lingered only in that direction, the faint return of the pine and smoke scent. I told myself I was verifying a secondary system. The corridor narrowed as I moved deeper. Frost coated the walls in thin vertical lines, like fingers dragged slowly downward. My breath fogged the air, though the temperature readings on my wrist display remained unchanged. Then I saw movement, not fully, not clearly. A shape at the far end of the corridor, partially obscured by shadow and structural supports. Large, too tall to be another engineer. It did not move toward me. It did not retreat. It simply occupied the space, as if it had always been there. The cold intensified, not suddenly, but completely. It wrapped around my hands, my face, my chest. The same cold I remembered from childhood. Not sharp, not biting, but deep and invasive, as if it belonged inside the body. I did not feel panic. I felt recognition. The sound came again, closer than before. Not a voice exactly, more like the memory of one. The same cadence, the same patient tone that had once called me from the snow. I could not see the face. I could not focus on details. Every time I tried, my eyes slid away, as if the shape resisted being fully perceived. But I saw enough, the outline of heavy layers, the unnatural length of arms held close to the body, the impression of stillness that felt intentional. And my feet, resting neatly against the wall, was a single wrapped candy. I did not pick it up. I stood there longer than I should have. Long enough for the frost to climb higher along the walls. Long enough for the air to grow so still that the station's usual hum seemed distant. Nothing happened. No step forward. No sound of approach. Only awareness. I understood then that the contact itself was the point, that I had been noticed long ago, and that this place, this season, had allowed the attention to return. When I finally stepped back, the cold eased immediately. The shape did not follow. The sound faded, not disappointed, not urgent, simply withdrawn. I left the auxiliary wing and did not return. From that moment on, the station felt different. Not hostile, not threatening, occupied. After that night, in the auxiliary wing, I moved through the station differently. Every step, every pause, every decision felt observed, measured, and subtly guided. I no longer questioned the phenomena. I accounted for them. The candy and small trinkets continued to appear, placed carefully, deliberately, but never threatening. I found a wrapper on a control panel, a single note folded into a corner, a miniature object that could have been overlooked if I didn't bend low to see it. Each one felt like a signal, a reminder that I was seen, remembered, and somehow acknowledged. I adjusted my routine. Long pauses in the corridors became intolerable. If I stopped for too long, frost climbed higher, drafts shifted, light dimmed just enough to remind me that attention lingered. I walked with purpose, keeping eyes on shadows and edges, noting where warmth seemed to fail and cold gathered. I could anticipate the subtle shifts now, moving in sync with the station's silent communication. The sound persisted, almost like a melody, faint and intermittent. It rose and fell in pitch just enough to seem natural, yet its pattern suggested awareness. It never threatened. It invited. Sometimes it reminded me of my own breathing. Sometimes of a lullaby I could not remember hearing before. Each repetition made me more alert, more measured in movement. Outside, snowstorms built gradually into drifts, burying vents and walkways. The wind whistled in the towers of equipment, carrying hints of pine smoke and icy sharpness. The seasonal ambience was ever present, reinforcing the reminder that this was a Yule unlike any I had ever experienced. The station felt alive in the way I had once imagined forests to be, attuned to presence and absence alike. The other engineers were mostly gone, on rotations, or leaving for the holidays. Eric remained mostly absorbed in procedural tasks, unaware of the small changes, the quiet dialogue I now understood. Occasionally, I left notes for him, reminders about valves or readings, but never mentioned the anomalies. He would pass by, glance briefly, and carry on, oblivious. I had no one to discuss what was happening with, and yet I didn't feel alone. I began noticing patterns in the placements. The trinkets and candies appeared in locations I would pass, but never on the paths of others. The cold gathered around the same corners when I lingered there, almost as if testing my attention. The voice, soft, almost melodic, echoed in subtle, non-random sequences. It was patient, precise, waiting for me to perceive it without scaring me. Sometimes I would turn corners more slowly, deliberately observing the edges, tracing the frost or lingering drafts with my hands hovering near the railings. Each movement prompted responses. Frost extended slightly along surfaces I brushed. Temperatures dipped a fraction more in my path. A candy wrapper appeared at the junction just after I passed. I realized I was being observed in the same way I had been as a child. Measured, patient, knowing. I experimented. I lingered in one corridor longer than usual, noting the shifts. I left a small note and signed just for myself. When I returned later, the note had not moved, but another had appeared nearby, folded differently. Its markings new, yet in the same childlike style. The presence seemed aware of me leaving, aware of my actions, subtly responding without aggression. I slept in shifts, careful to maintain routine, but never fully disengaged. The dreams were light, almost indistinct, yet the sensation of cold that carried through corridors sometimes followed me there, as if memory of touch had transferred to sleep. I woke to drafts that were colder than the ambient readings, and the faint scent of pine lingering, as if a whisper of the station itself was communicating reminders. Days blurred together. Yule passed with minimal contact from others. I moved through the station like a careful traveler through unfamiliar terrain, aware that my movements were never private. I left a small candy wrapper as a test, watched from afar as it remained untouched, while another appeared on the opposite side of the hall. I began to understand the rhythm, the pattern, the silent negotiation. It was not fear that drove me. It was awareness, recognition, memory intersecting with the present, and presence intersecting with memory. Each day, I became more precise in observation, more measured in movement, more attuned to the subtle signals that seemed to anticipate my actions. I carried that knowledge like a tool, guiding me, keeping me focused, keeping the balance between routine and the extraordinary. The station itself became a participant. Frost crept along surfaces as if painting attention where it mattered. Drafts tugged gently at coat sleeves. Light reflected in ways that accentuated corners, emphasized edges. The environment was a canvas, and I, the careful painter, moving according to cues I could just perceive. And sometimes, late at night, I would hear it, soft, patient echo of the same voice that had once called me from the snow. It never demanded, never insisted. It simply existed alongside me, a gentle, constant presence that shaped my perception dictated my timing, and tested my attention. It reminded me of my childhood, of moments I'd thought lost, yet were never truly gone. I understood then that I was in the same dance I had experienced years ago, measured, deliberate, patient. The figure did not chase, did not confront. It watched, responded, guided. Every placement, every draft, every note, every whisper was a thread connecting the past to the present, memory to reality. And I moved through it carefully, conscious that my actions mattered, and that observation, in itself, was its own form of interaction. I realized I had learned to live in this coexistence. Awareness had become my companion. The anomalies, the cold, the trinkets, the whispers, they were not threats. They were attention, patient, deliberate, and observant. And I had learned to move with them, to recognize them, to honor them, without ever demanding understanding. The days blurred further as the snow outside deepened, piling high against the station walls. My rotations were nearing an end. The relief team scheduled to arrive in 2 days. Even with the promise of leaving, I moved cautiously, attuned to every subtle shift around me. The environment had taught me well. Every breath of air, every shadow, every glint of frost could carry meaning. That morning, I noticed something different. A single candy wrapper lay on the control panel, positioned upright, almost balanced. Beside it, a faint indentation in the frost suggested a footprint I did not recognize. My heart beat with a familiarity I could not shake. It was the same pattern as before, patient and deliberate. I did not reach for the wrapper. I did not step closer to inspect. I simply observed, noting the alignment and spacing, understanding that attention itself was part of the exchange. Throughout the day, subtle cues persisted. Drafts moved in improbable directions. Light flickered with uneven rhythm. Frost crept along surfaces in patterns that seemed calculated. I walked with purpose, careful not to trigger further signs, yet aware that the presence responded to my observation. It was not malevolent, but it was attentive. And as I walked, I felt the weight of being remembered, not just by memory, but by something that had watched me long before and continued to do so. The snow outside intensified, wind-driven drifts pressing against the reinforced doors. I passed the hallways with careful steps, noticing how the frost had grown in crescents, how reflections in the metallic walls shifted subtly, as if acknowledging my gaze. I left small, intentional markers, notes, objects, without expectation. Some remained untouched. Others were accompanied by new signs in their vicinity. The interaction was quiet, patient, and enduring. By evening, the relief team radioed their arrival. I prepared for extraction, double-checking panels, securing systems. The station felt heavier with history, every surface, every shadow imbued with attention. As I packed personal belongings, a small note appeared on my workstation. It was blank, yet I felt its significance. It was a farewell, or perhaps a reminder that departure did not dissolve awareness. I moved toward the airlock, each step measured. Frost and shadows lingered, subtle signals following my passage. The wind outside carried faint echoes, almost like laughter or song, but distant and undefined. I did not look for the source. I did not call out. I only moved, conscious that observation continued, unseen yet undeniable. Crossing the threshold, I felt the cold bite differently, less environmental, more personal. It was as though the presence itself was acknowledging my leaving. The snow fell in silent flakes, obscuring details, blurring the boundaries between here and there. I ascended toward the extraction point, the familiar wind against my face, carrying an uncanny resonance, a soft, patient reminder that I had not escaped, that I could not entirely. Once aboard the transport, I did not speak of what I had witnessed. The presence remained with me, subtly insistent, a shadow on my mind. Even as the station receded behind me, every reflection in the window, every pattern of falling snow suggested awareness. It was no longer bound to the physical corridors. It was an imprint, a thread connecting memory and perception. Sleep was fitful. Dreams carried echoes of frost, shadows, faint voices that called my name. Sometimes I awoke to the sensation of cold on my hands, the subtle texture of frost along unseen edges. Awareness had extended beyond the station, beyond the past. It was embedded in my consciousness. I had left the location, yet I had not left the interaction. The presence had not been confronted, challenged, or defeated. It had been observed, understood, and integrated into my perception. My experience would follow me indefinitely, shaping how I moved, how I perceived, how I considered the boundaries between attention and observation. It had not chased, had not attacked, yet it had left a permanent mark. The knowledge that being watched and remembered was as potent as any threat. In the end, I realized the station, the cold, the subtle movements, the frost, and the faint voice, all were components of a patient awareness that would endure, unchanged by my departure. And though I returned to normal life, the lessons of observation, the sense of being attended to with deliberate care, never left me. I had learned to move carefully in a world that continued to watch, long after the snow had fallen and the doors had closed behind me.